Did you know Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are the same kind of politician? Now wait. Before you click off, let me explain. They don't agree on taxes, immigration, healthcare, or basically anything anyone would ever actually vote on, but strip away all of that, and both of them are doing the same thing structurally. There's a corrupt elite screwing you over, and there's a silent majority getting ignored. They just have different definitions of who that corrupt elite is, mainly because, according to them, they think it's each other. Trump's enemy is the deep state, and who better to embody that than someone involved in national politics for 35 years? Sanders' enemy is the millionaires and billionaires, so naturally that would be the gold-plated billionaire building a ballroom nobody's asked for. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what populism actually is, how the left and right versions differ, where each one has actually taken power, and why the same word describes politicians who probably hate being in the same sentence as each other. Welcome to Transatlantic Brief, where we break down the policies, institutions, and political movements affecting the transatlantic world in a way that's analytical, pragmatic, and hopefully accessible, so you don't need an advanced degree in political science or international affairs to understand any of it. Here's the mistake almost everybody makes. They hear populist and they think fascist, or they hear populist and they think socialist, depending on which cable news channel they were raised on. Populism isn't actually either of those, and it's not nationalism either, even though the three all get thrown around like synonyms. Fascism is a full ideology, ultra-nationalist, built around one leader, hostile to democracy itself, done with elections the second it wins one. Socialism is also a full ideology. Who owns the means of production, how wealth gets distributed, and actual economic policy that you can build a whole national budget around. Nationalism is a full ideology too. The nation as a primary political unit, loyalty to it above class, above party, and sometimes above everything else. Populism, on its own, doesn't have a budget. It doesn't tell you what to do about the minimum wage, or immigration, or borders, or anything else. It tells you who to blame and who's the hero, and nothing more than that. Which is exactly why it can attach itself to almost any full ideology and change how the ideology talks to people without changing what actually lies underneath. Pair it with economic left thinking and you get Bernie Sanders railing against billionaires and Wall Street. Pair it with cultural right thinking and you get Donald Trump railing against the media and the establishment. Pair it with nationalism specifically and you get Viktor Orban, who started out sounding populist and kept most of that once nationalism moved in for good, at least until he lost in a landslide a few months ago. You can't hear populist and think you've learned anything about someone's actual politics. You've just learned how they talk about their politics or how they frame us versus them. These aren't the same pieces of information. So when you hear populist and your brain wants to autocomplete it to fascist or socialist, just stop. Ask the actual question. Populist attached to what? Populism is a thin-centered ideology that divides society into two distinct groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. Thin-centered means populism by itself doesn't have enough substance to run a country. It can't write a tax code or set a foreign policy. It needs a host ideology to actually govern with. Left-wing populism grafts onto economic grievances. Right-wing populism leeches onto cultural and national grievances and identities. Both use the same underlying foundation, a virtuous us and a corrupt them, and a leader who claims to be the only one actually listening to us instead of managing us. That general will of the people phrase goes back to Rousseau, an 18th century Swiss philosopher. The idea that there's one true unified will of the people out there, and anyone who disagrees with the populist leader isn't just wrong, they're standing between the people and their own actual will. And keep that in mind, because that's why populist movements of both sides tends to get hostile towards the courts, towards the independent press, towards anyone positioned to check or question them. And nobody proudly calls themselves a populist either. It's usually a label thrown at you by whoever the corrupt elite in your story happens to be. So left-wing populism points the finger at economic power. The villain is the billionaire, the bank, the multinational corporation, Wall Street, and the corrupt elite is whoever's protecting them, usually the political establishment accused of being bought off. The term populism actually has its roots in the American political left. Specifically, the left-wing People's Party of the 1890s, made up of farmers crushed by railroad monopolies and hostile banks who built an entire movement out of that grievance. This actually was the driving force within the Democratic Party from the mid-1890s to Wilson's election in 1912. Populist William Jennings Bryan was the three-time Democratic nominee to be president in 1896, 1900, and 1908. He lost each time, and you'd think the party would stop doing that, but it looks like it's always taken longer than it should for Democrats to learn from past mistakes. His 1896 Cross of Gold speech remains the single most famous piece of populist rhetoric in American political history, where he framed the economic struggles of the day to a fight between the producing classes of farmers, laborers, and small business owners against the bankers of the Gilded Age. Does that sound familiar? Later in the 20th century, Latin America turned left populism into a governing style rather than just a protest movement. Juan Perón in Argentina is probably the best case of this, with direct appeals to the people, built around personal charisma, running straight over the heads of parties and institutions to get what he wanted. Latin America today remains the most successful case for this, at least in terms of electoral success. You can easily make the case that it's not successful for the people. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro turned left populism into full-state doctrine. Bolivia under Evo Morales ran a version built on indigenous identity layered over that same economic grievance. In Europe, Spain's Podemos and Greece's Syriza both rode the 2010 debt crisis into real governing power, blaming banks, austerity, and the EU's economic institutions. In the US, it shows up less as a governing party and more as a faction, Bernie Sanders being the clearest example, when he is a Democrat, operating inside the Democratic Party rather than replacing it. Right populism points the finger somewhere completely different: cultural and national identity. The villain is the immigrant, globalist institutions, the out-of-touch cultural elite, and the corrupt elite is whoever is accused of prioritizing outsiders over real citizens. You can trace this early history back to interwar Europe, where agrarian and nationalist movements were reacting against industrialization in cosmopolitan cities, though some of these cases sit close enough to fascism that historians argue constantly about where one ends and the other begins. The modern wave is much more recent, largely post-2008 phenomenon, with the financial crisis anger and it fused with immigration anxiety across the US and Europe at about the same time. Hungary under Viktor Orban was the clearest case of right populism actually consolidating long-term power, built around a liberal democracy, as an explicit governing label, at least until he lost in a landslide a few months ago. France's National Rally under Marine Le Pen and now Jordan Bardella has spent 2 decades turning street-level anger into the country's leading party in the polls today. Germany's AfD built support in the former East around immigration and EU skepticism. Italy has run right-wing populist governments repeatedly over the past decade. And here in the US, Donald Trump remains the defining case, built on America First, and open hostility towards the media, the courts, and the federal bureaucracy itself. Anything that stands in his way. Put them side by side and the framing is the same, it's just different wallpaper on top. Both frame politics as the pure people versus a corrupt elite. Both claim to speak for a silent majority nobody else is listening to. Both lean on a single dominant charismatic leader over party structure. Both get hostile towards the press and the courts, or really anyone who disagrees with them. Where they split is entirely in who gets cast as the villain and who gets cast as the people. Left populism blames concentrated wealth and defines the people economically. Workers, renters, anyone getting squeezed. Right populism blames cultural and demographic changes and defines the people nationally or ethnically, the true citizens against the newcomers and the cosmopolitan elites. That's the whole difference right there. The same structure, just opposing targets. One uses an economic divide while the other uses racial or ethnic divides. It also explains why left and right populist voters can sometimes swap sides entirely between elections. Because if you're angry at the system and don't have a fixed ideology underneath that anger, whichever populist tells the more convincing villain story that year can pull you in either direction. That's exactly what a thin-centered ideology predicts. The underlying beliefs that can be slapped onto whoever makes the better argument against this nefarious elite. So the next time someone calls a politician a populist as if that explains who they are or the policies they support, it doesn't. You still have to ask which version, aimed at which villain, and whether the corrupt elite they're pointing at is actually the problem or just the most convenient target available. But the answer to that question depends entirely on your politics. Populism isn't left or right on its own, it's just a rhetorical structure both sides have learned to use, built the exact same way under completely opposite politics, and both sides do it. Hope this cleared something up. If you're a fan of explainers like this, consider subscribing, and feel free to pass this along to someone who might benefit from this. Have a great one. I'll see you next time.